So it's my distinct pleasure this afternoon to welcome our special guests, the Right Honourable David Lammy MP and Sir Ian Blatchford, who will be in conversation about David's most recent book, which is Tribes, How Our Need to Belong Can Make or Break a Society, which was published in March 2020. Indeed, it's a fascinating book, and I really admire the way you were able to pull us into your personal journey, and we thank you very much for sharing your journey with us. So may I now formally introduce my guests? So we have the Right Honourable David Lammy, as I've said before, 7-time Member of Parliament for Tottenham and Shadow Secretary of State for Justice in 2020. David is an esteemed scholar. He's a strong advocate for changing lives. We know you're advocating for the Windrush and for Grenfell, which is really, really topical and important matters. You're a very respected author, and it's about 4 books, right?
3, probably.
3? 3 and counting.
Yes.
Okay. David was the first Black MP to hold the justice post, and he has been a politician for over 20 years. He was elected at the age of 27, and at that time he was the youngest member of parliament. And ironically, David, I don't know if you know this, but you were actually elected on the 22nd of June, 2000, and 19 years later, on that very day, the National Windrush Day was announced. So that's some synergy there. We thank you very much for participating in this conversation series. And then we move to Sir Ian Blatchford, who was appointed Director and Chief Executive of the Science Museum Group from the 1st of November 2010, and has combined this with his role as Director of the Science Museum from 2010. He chairs the National Museum Director Council, which represents the leaders of UK's national collections and major regional museums. So I want to thank you both for being here and for joining this conversation. We're looking for a very interesting discussion, and I'm sure that the audience, they are doing the same. So I'm now going to invite you to start the conversation.
Well, Paulette, thank you very much. And David and I are going to talk for half an hour, and I shall keep an eye on you in case we just go off in strange places and talk for too long. But it was very interesting that Paulette mentioned that your book was published in March. Not great timing, really. And in fact, that's why the book has a particular significance for me, because I'm a museum director, so I love visiting bookshops. And I was thrilled when they reopened. And when I walked into my favorite independent bookshop, there, glimmering, as you can see on the recommended table, was David's book. And I should explain that David and I have some history, because David was my minister many years ago when he was culture minister. So I have a memory of David in a way different from that some people hold. And so, David, I was really delighted when I started the book to discover that this incredible odyssey that your book describes, from your personal identity to thinking about identity politics and where Britain is going, the starting point is the Science Museum. So 2007, Tony Blair asked you to lead on the bicentenary of the first major Slavery Abolition Act. And the Science Museum asked you to do a DNA test, which you did. And what I was very intrigued by in the book, if I can dwell on that for a moment, is that you have a very complicated DNA mix. Sierra Leone, Bantu South African, Scottish, Celtic, but also 25% of your DNA is from a tribe in Niger. And in the book, you talk about this amazing journey visiting the poorest country in the world, torn apart by warfare and trauma. And I wondered why that 25% meant so much to you.
Well, look, I think it's probably true to say that if I think about the other component parts of my DNA makeup, I've been to Scotland. I've been to South Africa many times. In fact, my wife's half of my wife's family are white South Africans, and I have visited Sierra Leone as well, and I went on a fantastic trip with ActionAid to look at some of the work that that charity was doing in Sierra Leone. When I opened the envelope and looked at the DNA makeup, of course, you know, Scotland was a bit someone somewhere did something they shouldn't have done. But the truth is, I had never really heard of Niger. Most people who've grown up in Britain will not have heard of Niger because it wasn't a former British colony. That's correct. It's a country of quite a lot of desert. And I certainly never heard of the Tuareg people, tribe, that are sort of largely nomadic in that part of the world. And so, of course, that was instantly intriguing. I was really pleased that the Science Museum had asked me to do this DNA test as a way for the Science Museum. They asked a number of people to explore the subject of, at that point, commemorating the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. And the truth is, if you are of Caribbean descent or African American descent, then you, of course, there's a part of you that is reckoning with the fact that your origins are from Africa, that at some point there was a big interruption, you have lost the language, you don't know what tribe you are, you don't know which part of Africa, which country, and there is definitely a sense of loss that lives in people who are the descendant of enslaved people. So for me to go to Niger was a big deal. And actually the other thing about Niger, it is a black Muslim country. And so there was also a sort of dimension to Niger, going there and praying and being with black Muslim men that, you know, sort of evoked, I don't know, Malcolm X or something. There was something epic about it. And deeply, deeply personal. And that's what I try to describe and convey in the book. Very, very poor country, but people who took me, you know, into their arms.
Well, let me follow up on something you said there, which for me, I mean, what I loved about the book is that, I mean, the task before all of us is one of empathy and imagination in terms of understanding each other's identity and kind of how we see the world. And I'm very interested that you quote someone called Erikson, who was a German Jewish psychologist. And he did some very interesting work comparing the worldview of Native Americans, what used to be called Indians when I was a boy, and the Black American population. And it was very interesting reflecting on the long legacy of slavery in terms of a sense of identity. And you say that he made the distinction between a sense of loss and something different for people who are the descendants of slaves. You described it as the never was. And can you tell me what you mean by that? Because that seemed to me a pretty interesting insight.
I think the never was is not just, actually, let me come at this another way. One of my children, my youngest child, my daughter, is adopted. And for anyone who is adopted, that sense of loss and bond, who am I, where am I, why, what is my story, is very profound. And so I suppose the never was is the absence of story. You know, if you're from the Caribbean, we are island people, we're a couple of 100 years old, and you know, there isn't the depth and range that can exist in very old societies, is the truth. But yet there's something there, but it's just, you don't know what it is. It's been taken away. I think the other thing is also reckoning psychologically with coming from a place that's been hugely dehumanized. The truth is that, you know, several hundred years ago in European countries like this one, scientific racism was birthed. A pecking order was determined. That pecking order allowed effectively white privileged aristocrats to go out and colonize the world. And you know deep down inside that you were at the bottom of that heap, your ancestors were. So I suppose the never was is also the legacy of that dehumanization, knowing that you were less than.
I understand.
Never mind the fact that you don't know what the than was.
Yeah.
And so there is this sort of deep desire, I think, to create something from that story, to reckon the fact that we're still here, but to create something from that. And so it was very empowering to go to Niger, to be with those Muslim people, to roam with the Tuaregs, who have been nomadic people in that part of Mali, Mauritania, right up to North Africa, because they've been doing that for thousands of years, and it was something very special about it. And deeply sort of, as I sort of went to a barber or I looked at people, you know, there was this, could they be my relatives? And that was a sort of deep feeling. I wanted them to be my relatives.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Can I just follow up?
Yes, of course, Paulette.
How were you received? How did they receive you?
Fantastically. Partly because, so it's likely that my ancestor would have been a woman actually on this line. And there is a human trafficking, a slave trade from Niger to the coast to Sierra Leone and then out. So that probably accounts for the Sierra Leonean in me as well.
Right.
Very, very sadly, there is still, to this day, slavery in Niger, and I write about that in the book. And that's a source of great shame for a lot of folk in that country. And so they were they found it perplexing that I was sort of wearing on my sleeve that I was descendant of enslaved people in a country where slavery is still happening today.
I mean, you write wonderfully in the book about that, and there's a bit of dressing up. But my task is not to reveal the whole book, because people have got to buy the book. Another very striking section is, of course, you talk about the British Caribbean community. And your book is full of some absolute gems of quotes. And one of the first ones is this: I really thought this was unbelievably poignant. You say this: over time, the British Caribbean community has become less visible, even as its contribution to our society has become greater. That's quite a statement. Now, what do you mean by that?
Well, clearly the contribution of people of Caribbean descent in Britain is massive, in terms of vernacular, accent, and deeply in terms of culture, the arts, music, sport, great writers like Andrea Levy. So that story is pretty significant. But the other truth is, because there has not been renewed immigration from the Caribbean, there really hasn't been immigration from the Caribbean since the sort of late 70s, early 80s. And, you know, people of Caribbean descent, second, third generation people of Caribbean descent like myself, have married white partners and have mixed heritage children, some of whom have gone on to also have white partners, and then actually there is a sort of dwindling. There's a reckoning with a significant and quite loud community, but nevertheless a dying community that's disappearing. That in 100 years' time, there will obviously be black people in the UK, but they will largely be African, because there is still African immigration into this country. Now that could change, because Brexit could mean that...
Oh no, we're only 10 minutes in and we're already on Brexit. Thank you, David.
That's the irony of Brexit. As part of the trade deal, actually there is new immigration from the Caribbean, which I would find very amusing, I've got to tell you, for some of those who voted for Brexit. But nevertheless... Just
dwelling on, and the other thing, there's also great wit in your book, and there's a phrase you use talking about the Caribbean community, and I wasn't sure whether this was some eminent scholar or you made it up, but it's delicious. You talk about Afro-Saxonization. Fantastic.
I made that up.
Did you make it up? I think it's fantastic.
I had to get my tongue around that one. I had to practice that.
Yeah, I made that up.
But that's your point, isn't it?
To describe that. It's kind of, I mean, I suppose it's personified by someone like Stormzy.
Yeah.
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 Yes.
You know.
So, David, the other thing that for me was very striking about your book, I call it The Tale of Two Cities. So obviously, most people know you as the MP for Tottenham, but actually a huge part of your life is being a schoolboy in Peterborough. And in fact, I would say that you talk more about Peterborough than Tottenham. And also the surprise for people, there's a lot of deep listening to what I will describe as the white working class of Peterborough, okay? There's a quote here, which I think is pretty amazing, okay? You say, talking about how white community think about these issues and how we don't really understand each other. You say that the England that once knew itself from one generation to the next is threatened with implosion caused by cultural as much as an economic imbalance. And this is the amazing phrase, David. We have drifted so far apart that we no longer recognize each other's fears and dreams. That's quite a statement.
Yeah,
Can you just say what you meant by that?
Look, I think that's very true, and that gets to the nub of the book.
Yeah.
The book is about tribes. It is not about the Tuareg tribe. It is about the new tribalism in this country. It is about the fracturing, the division, a renewed tribal instinct in this country. And it was important for me in exploring that to go back to a part of the country that helped to make me the person I am today. And that definitely is the city of Peterborough, it's East Anglia. I'm quite sure I would not be a member of Parliament were it not for what that city gave me, which a lot of people might feel slightly curious, but I went to a good school, it was right at the centre of that town and that community, and it was Middle England. Because I think of the Brexit divide in this country, I wanted to go back to a town that I'm very fond of, where I have friends that are very fond of me and I'm very fond of them and their parents, and to talk to them. And these are people that have particular views on immigration. They have definitely views on the European Union. They have views on crime, law and order, the way this country has changed from the 1950s or 60s, or indeed the 70s or 80s when they moved to that new town. And I wanted to go back and write about that, not in a sort of sneering, metropolitan elite, Guardianista kind of way.
Well, in your book, I realised you and I think, have the same friends, because you talk about Guardian reading muesli eating liberals of North London. I know the same people.
You said that, not me.
Yeah. but actually, also, what's very interesting, David, is there's a running theme in your book. I don't know how to put this without being too provocative, but it seems to me that your frustration when you talk to those people, it's as if the progressive left did not engage with the issues of meaning, place, and identity.
That's right.
And I mean, I could say to you quite provocatively that you seem to be saying that actually the right has outflanked on that issue, that actually ignoring those issues is a big mistake, the meaning for people.
Well, can I answer that personally and generally? Personally, I recall when Tony Blair made me culture minister, there were some folk at the time, not you, Ian, but there were some folk who were nervous, particularly about the heritage part of that portfolio. And they were nervous that I would be deeply into modernity. I'd have no feel for the National Trust or the English heritage or our cathedrals or anything like that. And of course, that was the opposite of true, not just because of the experience of being a cathedral chorister, because the irony of enslavement is that my attachment to culture is deep and meaningful. And that's what I write about in that particular chapter. But equally, so it's not to sneer at all at people who live in more rural towns or more suburban settings where their sense of Englishness means a lot to them. Indeed, mine does, and I write about it in the book. And I say in the book that I've journeyed to a place where I demand to be English, despite the fact that some people question my ability to be English. But the truth is, in this atomized place that we have become, we do not always recognize one another from different parts of the country. And I want someone in Sunderland to have as much in common as a young person growing up in Tottenham, as a young person growing up in Devon.
Yeah.
And the book is about, in policy, political terms, how we attend to that, and does that matter?
Yeah.
And I'm definitely of the view that it does matter, and I'm pleased that this week the new leader of the Labour Party is signalling that he too thinks that country, place, family matters.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that later, because your book is also full of ideas about how we find a way to work together. But I want to focus just briefly on your identity as a politician, because I think that many people will have a kind of clear mental picture of what you campaign on, and that you give a very interesting example in the book of something that I wonder whether it is an issue for you, which is that you've actually campaigned and spoken about lots of things, and sometimes when you want to talk about things which are not about black identity, no one's listening. You give this so for example, I think of you making a real fuss about black students at Oxford and Cambridge, and I discover from the book, actually, that's not where you started at all. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. I mean, look, I'm comfortable with that these days, I've got to say, with the way that the media choose to cast you, because that's just how it is, and I know how to play it. But so it's because I went to Harvard, lucky enough to go to Harvard, and I couldn't believe that at Harvard it was more diverse than my school, or SOAS University of London, or even than my primary school in Tottenham. And why was that? Because I met kids from Middle America, places like Arkansas, white kids from Mississippi, black kids, Native Americans. I met a real spread. And I thought, and then when I was universities minister, I could see that the Russell Group was not like that. There were more young people with the surname Smith at Oxford than African Caribbean young people. And that was not all about grades. It really wasn't. And when I did the research I did and FOI'd the colleges, not just the universities, people think of the universities, but the colleges, I did freedom of information requests on geography, on class, and on ethnicity. And the truth was, the Today programme and The Guardian, which partnered to break this story, were not interested in geography. They were a little bit interested in class. They were very interested in race. And I found it ironic that despite the fact that the cities of Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle combined were sending less kids to Oxbridge colleges than the London Borough of Richmond.
Yeah, I mean, the conclusion from your research
story.
is if you want to get in Oxford and Cambridge, your ethnicity and gender doesn't matter. You just need to live in Surrey. Yeah, I mean, that's basically...
You need to be in Barnet, Richmond, or Surrey, or one of the southeast counties. And that determines where, and I thought that was a big story, but actually they went on race. And that is a huge story as well, but the point is, you do get pigeonholed. You do get, when I started in politics, Tony Blair gave me some advice. He sort of said, look, David, I don't talk about race. I'm not going to pigeonhole you in race, avoid race. Look, it turns out it was bad advice, because in a way you've got to locate yourself in your identity. That's where your power comes from.
And you have to be true
That's
to
where
that.
your authenticity comes from, particularly in an age of careerist, veneer, bland politicians. Well, that was the age.
We can't think who you mean.
That's changed now a bit. That's changed now a bit. But the point is, if you locate yourself somewhere, then you can move from there. And my experience is that even if people don't agree with what you're saying, they respect the way you were saying it and where you were saying it from. And to be heard in politics, that seems to me to be...
But you say something very interesting, because you reflect in the book on the huge arguments in the Democratic Party in the States. And Bernie Sanders' kind of hostility to identity politics. And you say something very interesting, which is if identity is going to be important for you as a politician, you've got to be clear about what you want, to be specific about the reforms and changes you want. Otherwise, actually people are not going to actually listen to your message.
Yes, you've got to be clear about what you want, and you've also got to be clear, and I want to make this really clear, that identity is not the beginning and end of the conversation. Because if it's about empathy, then identity politics runs the risk of just increasing the silos. That surely the end point is a common humanity and what I call an encounter culture where we're able to have dialogue. So yes, whilst I'm very clear on race, you know, I stood up on issues of sexuality, I definitely would describe myself as a feminist. That is not, I don't want to suggest that that is the end of the conversation. You know, it's a goal, it's an aim, but it's not the end of the conversation. And actually, as a politician, I'm interested in building a nation where we can have differences, we can negotiate those differences, and we can move forward together. I'm not interested in either a populist kind of lowest common denominator politics of either the extreme left or the extreme right, or indeed an identity-driven politics in which you know, someone like me loses the plot and thinks that race is the only agenda in town. It is not.
Well, I mean, in the book, there's so much rich material about what you call neo-tribalism. By the way, I mean, some of the evidence is amazing. My favorite, I mean, it probably says a lot about me. You quote something which is the US student narcissistic personality.
I found that very interesting
exactly.
too.
And basically what it does is survey students in America about their personal attitudes. And it compares 1982 with now. And basically the number of students who responded with an alarmingly narcissistic rating had doubled. But actually, my question is this. You quote very interesting work from someone called Cass Sunstein, who worked for Obama, and you talk about a really interesting concept of group polarization. And I think what you're getting at is when people are stuck in a particular silo, they gravitate to the most extreme view within their group. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, so this is the idea of closed communities. And the important thing to understand about where we are today, and these are big themes in the book, is that in some ways globalisation, of course, the collapse of work and productive work, particularly in the Western economies, but absolutely technology, social media particularly amplifying this, has led to these closed groups. And they're closed groups, whether they're on a WhatsApp group or a Facebook group or whatever, in which you gravitate to the most extreme members of that group. In that echo chamber, you hear one story, whatever that group is. And you can see that dynamics in politics. You can see that dynamic in race. You can see politics playing into race. And it leads to a very, very dangerous place. That's the serious end of what I'm writing about. So and also, but it makes the individual within that place, you can be quite lonely, because loneliness is another theme, feel really empowered. And so you feel narcissistic in your empowerment, which is sort of dangerous.
There's a very moving chapter on loneliness, but people will have to read that. I want to move to the kind of solutions part of your book.
Sir, Ian, I'm going to just ask one more question, and I'm going to ask the audience out there to start sending in their questions so that we can have a dialogue with the audience. Yeah.
Well, let me skip to really your section talking about building a different society. And one of the things that you suggest is that we might try and agree some common values. You talk about fair play, openness, and creativity. You also make a great joke in the book that by writing a list, how very British to write a list. But say something more about that. Why do you think that's an important task for us all to engage in?
Well, look, the starting point is to say that there are lots of countries in the world in which the business of nation building is powerful. Now, here in Europe, clearly modern Germany. Countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union engaged in a lot of nation building. Modern forward-looking countries like Canada, New Zealand, Japan. Countries attending to the business of forging a nation on a daily basis, a weekly, and governments returning to it. Strangely, here in England, because I must be careful, I'm not sure this is quite the story in Scotland, or indeed in Wales, and the island of Ireland has its own particular story. But here in England, other than perhaps when we lose in the World Cup or European Cup, and other than if you're an Anglican and you go to church and you sing certain hymns, and how are we attending to the business of forging a nation that connects life in Sunderland, Middlesbrough, with life in Leeds, Sheffield, down to Devon, Cornwall and London? How is that being attended to? And does that matter? I think it does. I think it requires leaders to think about that quite hard. It saddens me, and I'm going to make a partisan point, it saddens me that there is a powerful sense that the current government under Boris Johnson is governing for his tribe and not for the country. And I say that, and I want to distinguish Boris Johnson when I say that, to say it's not a totally partisan point, because I don't think I would have said that of David Cameron. Attending to the nation and the things that the nation can do to build a nation are important. Now, I put a list together of principles and ideas. Others will have their own list. And I suggested some ideas like a national civic service that everyone, young person, participates in a compulsory way, which is quite a sort of strong policy proposal. And I must say, I think
the phrase David Courageous Minister occurred to me when I read it.
Not front bench Labour policy at all. But interestingly enough, France is doing this now. Countries are returning to this now, because it's this building of actually, in this atomised place, how do we forge a nation? Strangely, coronavirus and the positive sides of things like the mutual aid, the huge support that people are giving in communities to those who are struggling, who don't have food, is a dimension of that happening. But I'm not sure that England is attending to that as strongly as it could be.
Okay. I've got 5 million questions, but I promise to behave.
Yes.
Over to you, Paulette.
Yes, okay, fine. And it's a very riveting conversation. And if people want to read more, I found it extremely fascinating. As I said before, there's more in the book. But I have some questions coming in. I have one here from Roger. It says, you talk about the paradox of the empire being built on subjugation, but the end result being a multicultural Britain with links across the world. Is this something that gives you hope?
Potentially, of course, because, if you've lived long enough, and you're, I hope, what people might call wise, then you understand deep in your heart that diversity is a good thing. Now, I'm not necessarily just talking about ethnic diversity. We invented universities that become great things because it's when the anthropologist meets the economist, meets the physicist, that inventions are made. That's how you get the Apple iPhone. Much of this museum is interdisciplinary. It's not just science, it's when science meets culture and the arts and application, and I'm looking at the first technology that gave us the BBC just opposite me. That's the power of diversity. So of course it's the case in terms of human beings that when we come into contact with one another, and in fact I write about this in the book, when man came out of Africa, Homo erectus and Homo sapiens then enters the world, that's diversity in action. So that is a powerful thing. And obviously, out of empire comes that connectivity, but not, I'm afraid, not if it's built on ideas of supremacy.
Right.
I'm afraid that is deeply problematic. And we have to accept that that's where empire starts. And very, very sadly, those ideas are still with us today.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Another question's coming, and Ian, I'm going to give you another question because I can see you want another one. I can see it in your face, but I'll give you another one. David, it says, you talk in your book about the possibility of different approaches to immigration in different parts of the UK. Do you really think that would be feasible?
Well, look, I explored in the book and explained in the book that there are some European countries, Germany and others, where immigration is actually at federal, regional level. And I did that because I thought it was interesting coming out of my experience of being in Peterborough. It was not to say conclusively that this is how it should be, but to say, would it be interesting if we allowed that power in different parts of the country? So, for example, the people of East Anglia might say, you know, someone starting out in this country with a national insurance number cannot come here because we don't need those skills. And we want jobs for local people. And there are pressures on whatever. Right. But I don't think London would reach that same conclusion, and there might be other parts of the southeast that wouldn't. And that experiment is going on in different northern European countries, and that's why I put it into the book so that it can enter the lexicon, so that policymakers can think about whether that has application here. Because in the end, the level of debate about immigration in this country has been so high, it's eclipsed other very, very important issues.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I have a question here from Jonathan and Edwin. David has a commendable record on racial, cultural, religious, and sexual tolerance, promoting inclusivity and acceptance. How does he think that tolerance, acceptance, and celebration of diversity can be promoted?
Well, I mean, I think that's about your values. I think that when you talk about minorities, we tend to think a lot about the ethnic bit of being a minority and not about the minority bit. And the truth of being black or brown in the UK is you have to come to terms with the minority bit. This is not America or North America. You are never, ever going to be in a majority situation in Europe. And that takes resilience. And I think it takes getting to a place where you realize that you're going to need allies in this story. And you're going to I have to be robust, of course, in the public space, but evoking empathy and compassion is going to be very important. So I have always allied myself with the fight for equality for people of different sexualities. I did a speech I'm very proud of when we debated same-sex marriage in Parliament. And you will recognise there are some within the black evangelical tradition that have issues with the fact that I have done that. And I have always allied myself on gender with those who are fighting for, still fighting for equal pay and still fighting the fight on behalf of women. Because the truth is, it's only with that allyship that you achieve progress. You cannot do it as a minority on your own. It's not going to happen.
Can I sneak in a supplementary? I suppose what's so urgent and interesting about the book is that if you go back a few years, we thought that everyone could have the rights and identity that they need and there would be no clash. But just before lockdown was the whole really difficult, traumatic issue in Birmingham with schools and teaching gay relationships and the dispute. And I'm going to cheat because this is where I deploy my identity as a gay man. And you basically had what I think is becoming more and more an issue, which is different identities. They clash. And what you're urging seems to me so crucial because we have to find some way of reconciling different views of the world, because otherwise it's going to get worse and worse.
So absolutely. So that is where the business of what kind of nation are you wanting to build, and what are some of those principles that are non-negotiable, where there is a clash, and how do you navigate clash and difference? Because the fudge, or the we won't say, and people can just fight their own corner, actually will become increasingly unsatisfactory and lead to a sort of, to a place of constant friction.
Yeah, I like your phrase non-negotiable, because you can imagine there was much conversation with friends and colleagues, and I said, look, just so we're clear, there's one right answer in my highly objective opinion.
My answer.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's probably the same as yours.
Paulette, I'm sorry, back to you.
No, that's fine. I have a question here from Vicky Clifton, and I thought I'd bring it in. It has to do with museum. What role can museum play in improving social justice? Speaking from Leeds, and welcome everybody from Leeds, I'm thinking about how best we can serve diverse audiences in those areas of complex and multi-deprivation. So what roles can museum play in improving social justice?
Great museums can play a powerful role. Local museums are really important in telling the story of neighbourhood and community. I actually, it's important, we haven't emphasised this so much tonight, but where we have the challenges of globalisation, where we have the challenges of building nation, it's going to be really, really hard to do that if neighbourhood and local is not going well. And the truth is, neighbourhood and local ain't going well. Local authorities have had their funding slashed for years. Local communities are on their knees. Museums play a really, really important role, but it's very hard to play that. If it's a tiny role in the corner, it's not at the centre. And so I talk a lot about growing up in an era where civic pride was still present and still celebrated, even though this was the 1970s. And in some ways, museums have been the figureheads for that now for several decades in this country, almost the only one. The arts and culture have, but it hasn't always felt right at the centre and endorsed by the centre, funded and resourced by the centre, and owned by the centre. And if all the money's coming from the lottery and it's sort of not seen, then there's not national ownership in that story. I argued, I'll share this with you, I argued that we should, this is when Gordon Brown was wanting to become Prime Minister, he was touting around for ideas. And I suggested to him that he should abolish the DCMS. Which is quite controversial, you might think that's quite scary.
That's a bit drastic.
But what I said was, in New Zealand, the DCMS is the Prime Minister's office. Make culture and the arts and sports yours. And then you're communicating how important it is as a department. So it wasn't a diminishing, it was actually putting it right at the centre. He didn't go for it, but it illustrates the point.
Yeah, I think I might have written the paper persuading him to turn down your idea, actually.
You are the root of that.
But just dwelling on that, if I may, Paulette, you talk very interestingly in the book about, use a phrase, a multitude of weak ties. And I think the point you're making is that because the public realm has shrunk, we encounter each other less than we used to. The reason I say that, museums are part of that, aren't they? We have a National Science and Media Museum in Bradford, and they did a wonderful exhibition recently about all the communities in Bradford. And I went to see the exhibition and realised it was a history of Britain that I didn't know at all. And so we're never going to make any progress unless we have moments where we're uncomfortable.
Yes. Correct. So, just to say, that is about museum, it's about the local choir in a local community and how people come together. It's about the history that you teach in schools. It's about how you finance and resource things like music and arts in the curriculum. It's about how you forge a civic service, and you say that that's a value. So it's a number of things that come together that bind those weak ties, and mean that in the end, my identity matters to me a lot, but for the greater good, which is our nation, I'm prepared to compromise.
And if I may cheat, you say something that I hadn't really thought about before, which is that it's really surprising bit of data, which is that the British trust each other more and more in opinion
They do.
polls.
That's the good news.
But by the way, that's a pretty awesome bit of information.
There's a lot to build on.
And you also say that actually in terms of common ground, NHS and a whole range of other issues, there are levels of mutual agreement that any Western nation would be amazed by.
Yes.
So isn't that kind of ironic? We
Yes.
feel this division, but in fact, actually, when we don't think about what divides us,
It's very hopeful.
yeah.
Come together. Yeah. And just following on very nicely to the point you made, Abby Wilson says there's been a lot of calls for overhauling the curriculum properly to include Black history and empire and its legacy. Do you feel that this could be a way of enabling us as a nation to forge a set of joint British values?
Yeah, I mean, I feel very, very strongly that, and this is particularly relevant at this point where Britain is breaking its ties with the European Union and wanting to go off into the world and forge new ones. If you're going to go and sit down with the Indians to forge a trade deal, or the Chinese, or most of the countries in the continent of Africa, you probably would do well to understand where they're coming from. Exactly. in relation to the period in which you ran their countries.
Exactly.
And because there's been an interruption now
Yes.
of 50 or 60 years, and you probably want to know where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And actually the truth of, and I think countries that are doing this successfully, countries like Canada, you know, as I said before, just like a great universities are wonderful at interdisciplinary stuff, you know, there is no weakness in looking at one's history in a way that says, this is also the view of those who were colonized. It's a different view. That is a strength. And putting those things side by side and asking students to work it out for themselves when those stories are side by side, and not telling, you know, we have powerful notions, like almost that Britain won the Second World War standing on its own. And they're intelligent people that believe that. I mean, members of the cabinet.
If you feed it to them often enough, they start believing it.
There were some difficult moments in sort of 40, 41 for Churchill, but actually Britain won the Second World War because we had a partnership with Russia. We had a huge important partnership where we persuaded America to come into the Second World War and bankroll us after it, and because of Commonwealth soldiers from places like where my parents are from, who assisted in that enterprise. That's how we won. Please just be honest and tell that story. Don't keep making films, Britain's darkest hour, that suggests that Churchill alone stood, and because it's not, that is a partial picture of the story. And it doesn't help anyone, actually, to perpetuate myths such as that one.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And that question could go on for a moment, but we're running out of time. Claire Wormsley admits, she says, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm intrigued by the loneliness that Ian refers to. Can you say a little bit about that in relation to community and tribes? I think, Ian, you
well, that's a very important, and it's a chapter that I'm very proud of. Loneliness is a growing theme. 41% of people in the UK describe themselves as lonely. and the thing that keeps them company, and it almost makes you emotional, is a pet or the television. Loneliness has been a huge theme of this coronavirus period. It's on the increase across the world. It's the underbelly of a lot of mental health. We've got a generation of millennials and Generation Y who are growing up believing that social media makes them popular, and you've got likes, and you've got followers, and you've got friends, yet they're lonelier than any generation has ever felt. And you know, you go out with a bunch of millennials or Generation Y. I mean, I don't, because my kids but I have staff who are generally younger than me, and they tell me, prescription medication for depression has been normalized in a way that I think was not the case a few years ago in this country. So it's an important theme, and in writing about it, I write about periods in my own life where I have been struggling with depression, where I have felt lonely, and actually it was after I finished at Harvard. It should have been on top of the world. I was working in a northern law firm, in California, North California law firm. I was earning more money than I do today, and still. And yet I was really lonely, and there were periods of loneliness when I was in Peterborough, and later on in my life as well. I have had these periods of depression. So I write about that and get into the subject. And I also talk in that chapter about two individuals that I come into contact with. One is a man who sends me death threats alongside 5 other MPs, and I go to his trial and I talk about the man I meet who was a rather lonely figure, and the other is a young man who is seduced to join ISIS and is sitting in his bedroom, a lonely young Muslim boy seduced by extremism. And so I talk about the consequences of that loneliness and where it can lead people.
All right, very powerful. And leading on, Harrison asks, to what extent can social media be blamed for the creation of a divide in Britain, given that particular news stories are presented to users based on their interest? So it's all the algorithms and...
Absolutely. It's a fundamental part of where we are in the Western world and in this country. At the moment, it's unregulated. It's the Wild West. These are companies largely based on the west coast of America. I've got a feeling that in 20 years' time, there will be far more regulation and it will feel slightly different. So it's a bit like tobacco many, many years ago. Definitely the algorithms, the silos, the anonymization, the vicarious way in which you enter people's lives, particularly for young people, I think. Instagram can leave you feeling, all the best photos of someone's holiday. It's not a real holiday. A real holiday is rows and the weather's shit.
I know.
And most people do not have abs like that. So all of that stuff has upsides, but also some downsides.
The people say, I have a lot of friends. I have 4,000 friends, virtual friends, but they're still lonely because that's just in the virtual world. We're coming close to the end, and Ian, I know you have a question. You had several questions. I'm going to defer to you for another question.
I suppose I want to finish by a quote from the book and ask you to reflect on it, because I was delighted to read that one of the people you quote is someone I really admire. Professor Steve Jones, the professor of genetics at UCL, who I've done an In Conversation with. And what's great about this quote is that although the book talks a lot about identity and DNA, it seems to me the quote is the essence of your book, which is that it matters, but actually we've got to build something beyond it. And this quote is so wonderful, and I wonder if you could comment on it. He says, almost everything is genetic, but we usually deal with it by changing the environment. It's a great quote. Isn't that really kind of what's driving your book?
Yes, it was. So it's important to understand that the book starts with my DNA and ends also with a DNA story that slightly debunks the whole business of looking for your roots. I don't want to give it away, but and I think it's true to say that in simple terms, actually, whilst we are navigating difference, and I suppose the whole business of being human in part is, for so many of us, curiosity of difference, and you know that's what love can often be about. That when you meet someone and you're excited, you want to be with them or whatever. But actually, in the end, it's getting beyond that to something more common and to a sort of shared environment. So I think that was in part what was being got at. But it's a complex underpinning. I might say this has been a very, very. I've done a few. I mean, even though the book came out during coronavirus, which means that people for a period were not able to go to the bookshops to buy it, I have been able to do a number of online events because people suddenly find themselves at home
and reading more,
or actually also audiobooks because it's on audio.
Yeah.
You can listen to me if you want to.
That's how
the paperback's coming out in I think next month.
Yeah.
This interview has been one of the most. It's had tremendous breadth. So thank you very much, Ian, for reading it.
Yeah.
Quoting bits back at me, it's made me feel even prouder of what I've pulled off. So it's been a really lovely.
And I love those moments where I've quoted your book and I can see you thinking, did I really write that? I know you well enough to know how you think.
Ian has read that book very, very well from cover to cover. But we're coming down to the end, and I was going to ask you to give a last word and something you want to say to the audience, and then I'll just round up. We have 2 minutes.
Great.
Well, David, I've known you for many years. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you this evening. You've been your usual, utterly uncontroversial, discreet self. But thank you, because, the timing of this conversation is extraordinary. I mean, climate change, recession, the American election, Black Lives Matter, the virus. Those are forces to pull us apart. As you can tell, I found your book fascinating, and I think Paulette would agree, actually very moving.
Very, very moving.
Very moving.
Yes.
So, I would urge people that although they think they know what's in the book, we have just given them a little flavour, so they need to rush out and buy a copy. Yeah. So thank you very much. And back to you, Paulette, and thank you so much.
No, thank you. It's been, yes, I know. And thank you so much, David, for being here. And thank you for sharing some very personal stories with us that a lot of people can identify with, and which will enable people to understand the position of the Caribbean people, who they are, what motivates them, and their pain. I think this conversation could have gone on much longer, but perhaps we can have part 2. I'm inviting you, Ian, to have part 2. Excellent. And I'm volunteering David to do part 2.
Could I just say, Paulette, that it's very, very special just to say that obviously the book starts with the Science Museum.
Yes.
So it's very, very, very lovely to come here many years later to talk about that DNA test I took and the journey that it made me embark on.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much for being here.
There's an elegant politician for you.
And thank you, Sir Ian, for being here and for sharing with us. And for those of you who have tuned in, I want to thank you very much for being here. Go and buy the book, and you will get certainly a bit more of David's journey and his wisdom that he imparts. And may I just thank the crew and everybody who put this together. I think it's a fantastic event and in a very beautiful setting here in the Science Museum. So to everybody, thank you all for tuning in, and keep safe. Thank you very much.